Politicians want to honor John. And I'm so grateful for the legacy and work of all the congressional leaders who are here. But there's a better way than a statement calling him a hero. You want to honor John? Let's honor him by revitalizing the law that he was willing to die for.
Former President Barack Obama delivering the eulogy for Congressman John Lewis today and calling to strengthen the Voting Rights Act. One of many calls to action today as the nation said goodbye to a man who worked his entire life to ensure democracy for all. The virus's deadly rise, 32 states now with increasing fatalities. Florida reporting its deadliest day for the third day in a row. The economic fallout, nearly 1.5 million Americans filing unemployment claims last week as expanded unemployment benefits expire. Will Congress act in time? Sowing seeds of doubt. President Trump tweeting about the possibility of delaying the election, but both Democrats and Republicans in Congress quickly dismissing the idea. Former presidential candidate Herman Cain dying of COVID, hospitalized after attending President Trump's rally in Tulsa. Storm watch. The tropical system gaining strength in the Caribbean. Could it become a hurricane as it approaches the U.S. mainland? Healing the wounds of history. How the first American southern city to provide reparations to the descendants of slaves plans to do it. And while much of the world is trying to keep Americans out, we'll take you to the one EU country where you can still travel without having to quarantine. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. Days after his death and just hours before he was laid to rest, we heard from Congressman John Lewis in his own words today. In an op-ed penned by the civil rights icon, he wrote, "Now it's your turn to let freedom ring." He said of his final days that he was inspired and filled with hope about the next chapter of the great American story, referencing the protests that have rocked America as an example of people using their power to make a difference in our society and demanding, quote, respect for human dignity. Throughout his life, the son of an Alabama sharecropper and longtime Georgia lawmaker talked about getting into good trouble. And today, 3 presidents and other dignitaries made it a priority to physically pay their respects despite the grave concerns and risks posed by the pandemic. President Obama called Lewis's death a call to action and took a shot at President Trump, who was not in attendance after the current president questioned if we should even hold an election in November. Today was an exceptionally busy news day, but we lead off with Steve Osunsami with the funeral of an American hero. Precious Lord.
This was the tearful goodbye in Atlanta today to an honorable man and lifelong public servant who once bled for the right of Black Americans to vote.
We thank you, God, for the life and legacy of Congressman John Lewis, who showed us this more excellent way of life.
John Lewis was the great-grandson of slaves, and at his funeral, in the middle of this pandemic, were 3 U.S. presidents who came to pay their respects.
John Lewis was a walking rebuke to people who thought, well, we ain't there yet, and we've been working a long time. Isn't it time to bag it? He kept moving.
Listen, John and I had our disagreements, of course. But in the America John Lewis fought for, and the America I believe in, differences of opinion are inevitable elements and evidence of democracy in action.
His relationship with President Barack Obama was an important one. Like many Black Americans, Lewis was in tears the night history was made and Obama was elected. In his eulogy, Obama pointed to this important moment, the bloody Sunday on this bridge in Alabama, when Lewis nearly lost his life at the hands of police while marching for voting rights. It was months later when the laws changed and many in his own family were able to vote for the first time.
This idea that any of us, ordinary people, a young kid from Troy, can stand up to the powers and principalities and say, no, this isn't right, this isn't true, this isn't just. We can do better. America was built by people like them. America was built by John Lewis's.
The former president argued that forces are still trying to suppress the vote today, right now, in November's election.
Even as we sit here, there are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting by closing polling locations and targeting minorities and students with restrictive ID laws and attacking our voting rights with surgical precision, even undermining the Postal Service in the run-up to an election that's going to be dependent on mail-in ballots so people don't get sick.
Outside, people watched and waved in the heat. Lewis was beloved and was buried tonight in an Atlanta cemetery founded by freed slaves who at the time had nowhere else to bury their dead with dignity. The final resting place for a man of so much purpose.
Such a touching and fitting tribute for a giant of a man. Steve Osunsami was there. He joins us now. And Steve, so many of those speakers honoring Lewis, his life, but saying that his work is not yet finished. What struck you as you watched the service?
Well, I was struck by the many people who we saw lined up outside in the heat and humidity listening to all of those words, and people who we saw in cafes who couldn't get inside the church because the church was being limited to about 240 people because of coronavirus concerns, people who were watching from different places across town, and the diversity of those people, not just black residents, but white residents, gay residents, women. In fact, his family made sure that as his body was being driven through the streets of Atlanta, that they made sure to drive through the heart of gay Atlanta, where the streets are covered, the crosswalk is covered in a rainbow painting. That was very important to his family. And, you know, one other thing that I should say that was also brought up a number of times here at the funeral was about concerns about the upcoming election in November. You know, the last primary election we had here didn't go so well. It wasn't smooth at all, and part of that was because of the coronavirus. But there is a great deal of concern that many of the issues that this congressman was fighting for are going to play themselves out in this upcoming election. And so we heard the message over and over again, encouraging residents to vote by mail and vote early.
Yes,
Lindsay.
so many of those speakers saying if you want to continue his legacy, vote. All right, Steve Osunsami, thanks so much for your reporting.
Absolutely.
And now to Washington, where just hours before the service began for John Lewis, President Trump sent out a tweet suggesting that Election Day be delayed. That set off a firestorm, and in a rare move, Republican leaders joined Democrats to dismiss the president's suggestion. Terry Moran has the latest.
No president has ever said anything like it, but President Trump, behind in the polls with a cratering economy and a pandemic out of control, tweeting today, with universal mail-in voting, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote. Later, the president tried to explain what he meant.
Do I want to see a date change? No, but I don't want to see a crooked election. This election will be the most rigged election in history if that happens.
That's a flip-flop. In April, Trump said this.
I never even thought of changing the date of the election. Why would I do that? November 3rd. It's a good number. No, I look forward to that election.
Trump's statement today about delaying an American election was shot down immediately by Democrats and Republicans. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in an interview in Kentucky.
Never in the history of the country, through wars, depressions, and the Civil War, have we ever not had a federally scheduled election on time.
But Joe Biden has been warning for weeks Trump might try to use the pandemic to delay or delegitimize the election.
It's my greatest concern, my single greatest concern. This president's going to try to steal this election. This is the guy who said that all mail-in ballots are fraudulent, voting by mail, while he sits behind the desk in the Oval Office and writes his mail-in ballot to vote in the primary.
The former vice president certainly not pulling any punches there. Terry Moran joins us now. And Terry, ABC News reached out to election officials in all 50 states about whether they're concerned about mail-in voting fraud. What did those states say? And are there real concerns about the difficulty of counting so many likely absentee ballots?
It's a huge challenge, Lindsay, no question about it. Secretaries of State and top election officials, we've heard from 27 so far across the country, and not one of them, Republicans, Democrats, not one of them have expressed any concern that mail-in voting would cause any significant fraud. Now, the difficulty in counting them, we've already seen that in some of these primary elections. It's hard. These are physical ballots. They've never seen these numbers that are expected on Election Day. President Trump says if it's not counted on election night, it shouldn't be a legitimate election. Well, most elections in American history, we didn't know the results election night because there wasn't television, there wasn't radio. It wasn't until, I believe, 1920 that the election was decided on election night for the American people. So there's no concern there as well. But this is a challenge logistically, but not according to the top election officials. Is it a challenge to the integrity of the election?
And we saw both Democrats and Republicans dismiss the idea of moving the election entirely. But let's talk about the concern that the president is undermining faith in the election with these constant attacks.
You know, that's huge. I covered the election of 2000, the Bush-Gore election, which was thrown into the courts, and there was a great deal of anguish at that time. Even though there weren't any really desperately pressing issues, people got hugely upset. They said the other side was trying to steal it. It seems every time since then, there's been a growing number of people who don't trust the election processes at all. Obviously, this is one of the aims of the Kremlin and other American adversaries to undermine the legitimacy of the election, and people are concerned that President Trump, wittingly or unwittingly, is playing right into that plan of our adversaries to weaken Americans' trust in their own democracy. That's why these secretaries of state and top election officials, they say, we can do this. It's going to be hard, but we can do it.
We can do it. Okay, Terry Moran, thanks so much for your reporting. And while the president has claimed in recent days that much of the U.S. is corona-free and today once again asserted that students should head back to classrooms, here's a look at a map based off of the White House's own report showing which states are in the so-called red zone and which are in the yellow. Only one state was green. That was the Green Mountain state of Vermont. 21 states had outbreaks severe enough to be declared red. The report compiled for state leaders along with evidence that encouraging masks and closing bars was helping. All this as the death toll soars, more than 151,000 Americans dead. That's the equivalent of 50 9/11s. Our Victor Akendo has the latest now from Florida, where for the third straight day, they broke a record in deaths.
With the coronavirus ravaging so many lives, the devastating toll on American livelihoods is growing. In Los Angeles today, long lines for food.
It's helped a lot.
1.4 million people filing for unemployment last week, just as those emergency $600 benefit checks for 30 million Americans expire.
We are approaching our food bank that we go to.
Those checks and food banks, a lifeline for Scott Stengenga's family in New Jersey. He was laid off more than 4 months ago.
We're not beggars. We're not asking for, anything. We want to get out of this. What has me stressed out the most is running out of money.
For the virus, no end in sight. California, North Carolina, and Florida this week, all hitting record daily death tolls. Making matters even worse here in Florida, with a tropical storm approaching statewide, all public testing sites like this one on Miami Beach, they're shutting down today through the weekend. During that same 4-day stretch last week, nearly 350,000 people were tested. COVID taking its toll inside Houston's United Memorial Medical Center.
But if you got a death wish, catch COVID.
The team seeing one of their own nurses sicken too.
The hardest thing to ever hear is that you're positive.
Dr. Joseph Ferrone giving her a hug in full protective gear. The doctor feels like he's fighting two wars.
A war against COVID and a war against stupidity.
He's frustrated seeing people on the streets not wearing masks or physically distancing.
We keep on doing our best to save all these people, and then you get another batch of people that are doing exactly the opposite of what you are telling them not to do.
An association of medical colleges now warning if the nation doesn't change its course, and soon, deaths could be well into the multiple hundreds of thousands. But for 2 COVID patients, a second chance. Doctors at Northwestern saving them with double lung transplants after the virus destroyed their lungs. Brian Kuhn spent 100 days on life support. The 62-year-old says it's a miracle he's alive. He admits he thought the virus was a hoax.
I didn't wear a mask or nothing. It hit me like a lead slammer on my head. I was perfectly healthy. This thing took me down hard.
And tonight, some news on the vaccine front. Johnson & Johnson is moving into human trials after releasing some promising data on monkeys, showing that its vaccine given in just 1 shot can protect against infection. Lindsay?
Promising news there indeed. Our thanks to you, Victor. And one of those more than 151,000 American deaths due to COVID, Herman Cain, the businessman turned former Republican candidate for president, shared this photo of himself without a mask at President Trump's Tulsa rally late last month. He tested positive for COVID days later and passed away this morning. Here's ABC's chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl.
Herman Cain, the former presidential candidate who tested positive for coronavirus 9 days after attending President Trump's rally in Tulsa last month, has died. Local health officials had pleaded with the president to cancel the rally, where Cain appeared without a mask.
The Trump Tulsa rally, I was there.
Cain said the campaign took precautions, distributing hand sanitizer and checking temperatures.
Even though it was a crowded room of people, if they took precautions, probably not going to be a big uptick.
It's unclear if Cain was infected at the rally, but 9 days later, he tested positive. And 2 days after that, he was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, where he spent nearly a month. Cain grew up poor, but made a fortune in the restaurant business, the CEO of Godfather's Pizza. He launched an improbable campaign for president 9 years ago with a catchy economic plan.
Remember, the 999 is a 9% business flat tax, 9% personal income flat tax, and a 9% national sales tax.
And even more improbably, he briefly emerged as the front runner, perhaps the most successful black Republican presidential candidate in history, until his campaign was derailed by sexual misconduct allegations. Still, Cain is remembered as a political celebrity and became an enthusiastic supporter of President Trump.
Certainly a big supporter of President Trump, even in recent weeks. Jonathan Karl joins us now. And John, the president weighed in on Cain's death earlier today. What did he have to say? And did he at all mention Cain's attendance at that Tulsa rally?
Well, no, he didn't mention the Tulsa rally at all and Cain's attendance. Of course, it was just days after he went to that rally that he tested positive for coronavirus. The president did not mention that, but he did offer his condolences to the Cain family. He called Herman Cain a wonderful man and a dear friend, but no reference to the Tulsa rally.
Jonathan Karl for us in the nation's capital. Thanks so much, John. Millions of Americans have been personally feeling the impact of this economic downturn. And today we learned that the U.S. economy as a whole, measured by real GDP, contracted a record-shattering 32.9% last quarter. To break all this down, what it means, we bring in ABC's chief business correspondent, Rebecca Jarvis. Thanks so much for joining us. Help us put this nearly 33% drop into perspective. I mean, how does this compare to other economic lows, and how hard will it be to get back to pre-pandemic growth?
Well, Lindsay, it's historic no matter how you look at it. It is worse for a single quarter than we ever saw during the Great Recession. It's worse than we ever saw for a single quarter during the Great Depression. And if you think about it, it's not entirely unexpected. The economy here in the United States was entirely shut down for most of the last 4 months. And really, when you think about your own spending, if you look at your credit card statement, for example, you're going to see a reflection of the fact that you weren't going to the gas station, you weren't buying coffees very likely, and you probably weren't shopping for very much other than food. And that's the thing. We are a consumer-driven economy. Consumers were told to stay home. They were laid off and furloughed from jobs, and that's exactly what this is a reflection of. The big question is, what now? Now, as things begin to reopen, what kind of rebound will we see? We will see some sort of rebound, but in order to climb back to where we were pre-pandemic, that's going to take a while. while. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, crunched the numbers, and they believe that over the next 10 years, this pandemic will cost our economy here in the United States $16 trillion, Lindsay.
And this data covers the months that we were in lockdown. The president's spokesperson today pointed out that we shouldn't assume that the economy will stay this way and that more than 7 million jobs were created once businesses reopened. So what do economists say about that?
Well, the hard part in this, Lindsay, is that as we've seen the economy reopen, some people have been rehired. And in fact, they were rehired, especially towards the middle of May and June, at very quick rates. The problem is that that hasn't held on. And in fact, today, the other data point that we got, in addition to GDP, is the number of layoffs that we saw last week. And that number is climbing. We saw more than 1.4 million Americans file first-time claims for unemployment. That means 1.4 million plus new layoffs last week, and the number of unemployed Americans happens to be climbing now as a number of states return, they roll back these reopenings, and also consumers, as we've talked about so many times here before, we as consumers have a lot of control over what happens in the U.S. economy. If we're not spending money, then the U.S. economy isn't growing, and when jobs are at risk, when health and our health is a question mark, people spend differently, and that is bad for the economic growth of this country.
Rebecca Jarvis, thank you so much for your time and just explaining it in a way that we can all understand. We appreciate it. So many American families already on the brink, and tomorrow those enhanced unemployment benefits, $600 a week, set to expire. We bring in ABC senior congressional correspondent Mary Bruce in Washington, where lawmakers are scrambling to pass another stimulus. Thanks so much for joining us, Mary. Today, congressional Republicans hastily called a vote to extend those benefits. What happened, and how did the Democrats respond?
Well, this was really a last-minute attempt by Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans to try and extend these unemployment benefits, but instead of the $600 amount that millions of Americans have been receiving, they wanted to bring that down to just $200, and that is simply not going to fly with Democrats. They called this move a callous political move, a stunt by Republicans who they say have had weeks now to come up with a more comprehensive plan. Democrats, of course, released their bill more than 2 months ago. Republicans, though, have struggled within their own party to get on the same page. And now with these critical unemployment benefits set to expire, those checks have actually stopped coming for millions of Americans. Republicans were trying to do something today to try and prevent some of this pain from hitting so many Americans, but it simply doesn't appear that it's going to work at this point. Democrats say they don't want to do this piecemeal. They want to focus on a large, comprehensive stimulus bill, and Democrats want to keep those checks coming at that $600 amount.
And Congress is, of course, set to recess at the end of next week. Is there any hope for a plan before then? And what happens if time runs out?
I have to tell you, Lindsay, right now it is really hard to see how the two sides are going to come to an agreement, especially since the Republican Party can't even seem to come to an agreement within themselves. So even if and when they can actually agree on a broader package here, it looks like that could take weeks. And that means that millions of Americans are going to take a hit. It's also likely to take a huge toll on the economy.
Mary Bruce, our thanks to you. The hard-hit island of Puerto Rico has been battered yet again. Take a look at these images of the life-threatening flooding caused as Tropical Storm Isaias made landfall. Puerto Rico's National Guard rescuing people from the water. It is the last thing the American territory needs right now. And now the storm is gaining strength and could be a hurricane near Florida. The last thing that they need there. Our Rob Marciano is there and files this report.
Tonight, Tropical Storm Isaias has Florida and the southeast U.S. in its sights as it lashes the Caribbean with nearly a foot of rain and powerful winds. In Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, children, some as young as 3 months old, carried to safety by the National Guard in high-water vehicles. This as floodwaters rage through neighborhoods. Across the U.S. territory, widespread flooding, downed trees, and mudslides blocking roads. Near San Juan, authorities opening up multiple floodgates on this dam to keep the runoff water under control. Transformers exploding before dawn. 400,000 customers losing power and at least 150,000 with no running water tonight. Puerto Rico's been under a pretty bad drought the last couple of months, but clearly too much water in too short a period of time, and it's still raining there this evening. The center of this thing is trying to reform north of the Dominican Republic, where there are now tropical storm warnings posted for that island, the Turks and Caicos, and watches posted now for the Bahamas and right here across the southeastern coast of Florida for tropical storm conditions in the next 48 hours. Here's the forecast track now for the National Hurricane Center, bringing it to hurricane strength now because they do think it's going to take more of an easterly track, and that does incentivize some strengthening. Saturday's strength, 75-mile-per-hour Category 1 storm getting abreast of, say, Miami, West Palm Beach Saturday night, and then traversing up towards northern Florida during the day on Sunday, and then potentially in through the Carolinas during the day on Monday. There will be some limiting factors to get it to strengthen much more than a Category 1, but there is very, very low confidence in not just the intensity, but the forecast track. Our computer models right now are showing a pretty tightly clustered bunch, but how they initialize where that center reforms tonight as it reemerges north of the DR will be key as to what that track takes over the next 5 days. Lindsay?
Yeah, lots of concern right now for the southeast. Our thanks to you, Rob. And when we come back, the early morning jolt felt across Southern California and the aftershocks that continue to rumble. The second former Marine convicted in recent weeks in a Russian court during a trial of the U.S. ambassador there called Absurd. Are Americans being targeted? But up next, our journey to the southern city that approved reparations for the descendants of slaves. This is possibly a blueprint for other communities. Welcome back. The national debate over reparations for slavery reached a historic milestone this month as Asheville, North Carolina became the very first city in the South and only the second in the nation to formally approve financial restitution for black residents. Tonight, we take a closer look at what the so-called reparations would actually mean and ask, could the city be possibly a model for the rest of the country? Here's ABC's Devin Dwyer.
In the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Asheville, North Carolina is a bohemian retreat.
It's become a bit of a mecca for people to gather that have a more, liberal sensibility.
The city's arts and architecture scene drawing tourists from all over the country.
We have a very diverse culture here to where it's not like any other county that's near here.
Its unique history also reflected in a shrouded monument towering above downtown. A granite obelisk erected for a local Confederate leader and slave owner, now a symbol of racial justice and demands for change.
Where this monument is used to be the market where they would trade slaves at.
Just before the Civil War, public records show 283 white residents in Asheville owned more than 1,900 slaves. Asheville native Rob Thomas says the time has come for reparations.
A lot of people say, well, slavery, I wasn't around, you wasn't around. Okay, but what about how we have been systematically oppressed and our economic floor destroyed nationwide through different government programs, policies, procedures, predatory lending, redlining, block busting. I mean, the list goes on.
Asheville City Council this month voted to remove the monument and to formally apologize for the history it represents.
Do we have a motion to adopt the resolution?
A reparations resolution, which passed unanimously, promises financial restitution for slavery and decades of discrimination that followed.
A lot of people just think reparations is about writing a check, and that's not what this is about.
The City Council says a commission will develop plans to promote black home ownership and business opportunities, but the amount of investment is still unclear.
What we have committed to do in this resolution is invest in and create systems and programs and structures that will allow those community members to have the same opportunities for economic mobility, to build generational wealth that white people have.
The city says it won't raise taxes to pay for the programs and also won't make direct payments to descendants of Asheville slaves. Residents are sharply divided.
If you're going to pay reparations for all the things that we now judge to be bad or wrong, the Roman Empire would have to, Greece would have to pay back the world.
Well, in order to get over it, you got to go ahead and do something about it. So in my mind, it's a great thing that they did something about it.
There is not racial equity in Asheville by any stretch of the imagination. We are the poster child for segregation.
The median income for all Asheville families is over $42,000, but for black families, it's just $30,000. The wealth gap is even more staggering. Nationwide, the net worth of a typical white family today is 10 times greater than that of a typical black family.
This used to be all owned by black people.
Advocates say urban renewal programs have compounded the problem, uprooting black families and businesses, including many along Asheville's historic Eagle Street. Thomas says redlining by banks, the denial of loans to creditworthy people of color, kept many from coming back.
Now, black people can't even afford to be on this block. That's right.
The protests for racial justice this spring brought Asheville, like so many other American cities, to a boiling point. Black and white voices shining a light on the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, pressuring local leaders to address the racial economic divide. Providence, Rhode Island, and Richmond, Virginia, the former Confederate capital, now looking to follow Asheville's lead. Last year, Evanston, Illinois, became the first U.S. city to fund reparations for black residents.
How are we going to go about doing this in a meaningful way?
You want to see actions, not just words.
Correct. You'll have payments that go to individuals where they may be de minimis at best, and then they are also still under the control of a government entity, as opposed to allowing the people themselves to use those funds in a way that benefits them best.
Several leading economists say direct payments to African Americans are the most fair and effective way to bridge the wealth gap, which some estimate at $13 trillion.
These local efforts of atonement, however well-intentioned and however desirable, are not reparations by any means.
Duke economist William Darity says the federal government should reimburse black Americans for slave labor, just as they paid Native Americans for their land and Japanese Americans for the indignity of internment camps during World War II.
And the federal government is the culpable party because of its historical complicity in the process of maintaining slavery. Most of these local initiatives are a variety of forms of pulling the knife out, which is essential, but it's very, very different from healing the wound.
He's right. This isn't reparations in its truest form. But in order to reach what he is talking about, first we have to do it on a local level.
As some cities move forward, reparations proposals in Congress have so far failed to gain widespread support. Just 31% of Americans in a recent ABC News Washington Post poll back direct payments to descendants of slaves. Most Americans, 63%, are opposed.
And when you talk about making restitution, how do you make restitution for folks that are not here? People that were hurt are gone. People that helped are gone. And so, in my opinion, we ought to look toward the future and work from here and quit dealing on the past.
You all kind of agree with that this is sort of a misplaced, both for financial reasons and for historical reasons?
I would say yes. None of us were there. We weren't involved in it, so why should we pay?
Resistance to reparations comes as some white Asheville residents say the death of George Floyd in police custody this spring led to an epiphany.
It was just such a bold and unmistakable example of the kind of brutality that has been happening for centuries.
David Greenson spoke out in favor of reparations before the city council, making a moral case.
White people in this country need black people to get reparations because to the extent that we have been complicit in this happening, then we carry the moral injury of that.
For now, Asheville's history-making step is mostly just words on paper, a blueprint for reparations the city hopes others can follow.
The lesson I would hope other local governments take is you can do this. It's not just about writing a check. Don't let yourself get boxed in by people who want to box you in that way. Look at the broader system and look at what you can do to enhance investments.
Until those investments come, Rob Thomas says he'll keep up the fight. The community that made him now depending on him.
What made me is all the seeds that my elders planted in my head as a youth that I didn't listen to at the time. And then once I was able to cultivate my mind and actually feed those seeds with the proper nourishment, now I have these beautiful trees and bushes that are producing the fruit that you see today.
For ABC News Live, I'm Devin Dwyer in Asheville, North Carolina.
Such an interesting look there. Our thanks to Devin for providing that. And still to come, while most countries are banning American travelers, we take a trip to Croatia, one of the very few letting us in. Just how difficult is it to get there? The family of murdered soldier Vanessa Guillen went to Washington to demand change, what they asked for, and the president's response. And speaking of President Trump, as he continues to express concerns about the election, our look at the other difficult times in American history. Can you guess how often we've changed the timing of a presidential election? But first, our tweet of the day. For the first time, Oprah not on the cover of her magazine in honor of Breonna Taylor. And welcome back, everybody. In light of President Trump's tweet suggesting that we delay our November 3rd election because of expanded mail-in voting, we take a look at past elections and current election security by the numbers. A federal law passed in 1845 makes Election Day the first Tuesday of November. Only Congress can change that law. The president cannot. Our Constitution makes January 20th the last day of a president's term, something President Trump also cannot change. Never. 0 times in our country's history has a federal scheduled election been delayed. The election of 1864 was held in the middle of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln won re-election and said that the war was about democracy, so democracy should never be suspended, according to historians. Federal elections also happened on schedule during the 1918 Spanish flu and twice during World War II in 1942 and also 1944. Today, election experts tell us we can hold a fair and accurate vote during this pandemic, and nearly 30 state election heads reached by ABC News expressed no doubt in their state's ability to protect election integrity with expanded mail-in voting. In 2016, 33 million Americans voted by mail-in or absentee ballot, so voting this way is certainly nothing new. And still lots to come here on Prime. Our passport, once one of the world's strongest, now most nations won't let us in as COVID cases here soar. Our journey to one of the few nations still letting us visit and why they say it's important that we come. The spectacular launch and the long journey to Mars. What we hope to learn from this mission. And later, John Lewis was just a young man when he risked his life for change. And now there's a new generation taking up the mantle. We'll hear from a few. But first, here's a look at some of the trending stories on abcnews.com.
final goodbyes. The funeral service for Representative John Lewis taking place Thursday, closing an historic chapter in American history. Former President Barack Obama delivering the eulogy, paying tribute to Lewis's life and legacy.
John Lewis will be a founding father of that fuller, fairer, better America.
Two other former presidents, George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, also attending the private funeral.
We live in a better and nobler country today because of John Lewis.
He kept moving. He hoped for and imagined and lived and worked and moved for his beloved community.
We always knew he worked on the side of the angels, and now he is with them. May he rest in peace.
Florida marking a third day of a record number of deaths from COVID-19.
We are the global hotspot, and we have mismanaged this virus in a way that I think much of the world simply can't believe.
In Minneapolis, Minnesota, indoor bars now shut down, with young adults making up more than 50% of new cases.
New York, once the epicenter, now dealing with a slight uptick in cases.
Governor Andrew Cuomo says bars and restaurants not following COVID-19 restrictions continue to be cited.
On Wall Street, the Dow dropped more than 225 points after the Commerce Department reported
the American economy contracted nearly 33% compared to a year ago. It's slightly lower than economists were expecting, but still the biggest decline since World War II. The figure covers April, May, and June, when much of the economy was shut down due to the pandemic. Whether the recovery is as quick or robust as hoped depends on the virus, which has surged in much of the country. The number of new layoffs is increasing. 1.4 million people applied for unemployment benefits last week.
Mother of Army Private Vanessa Guillen traveled from Texas to talk with the president about a proposed bill in Vanessa's name. The legislation calls for new ways to address reports of sexual harassment and assault in the military. A search for the 20-year-old began in April. Her body found on June 30th buried near a lake.
The FBI and the DOJ are now involved. We got them involved. And the people at Fort Hood, where it took place, are very much involved. We didn't want to have this swept under the rug, which could happen. But we're going to look into it very powerfully.
Her alleged killer took his own life as investigators closed in on him.
A rude early morning alarm from Mother Nature this morning in Southern California.
People are on edge here in Los Angeles after being woken up around 4:30 by a jolting 4.2 magnitude earthquake, followed by a couple of significant aftershocks. There doesn't seem to be any real damage or injuries.
0.
Release. Firing into the sky from Cape Canaveral this morning.
The biggest, most sophisticated Mars rover ever built is now on its way to the Red Planet. NASA's Perseverance launched into space aboard an Atlas V rocket today and will take about 7 months to travel 300 million miles.
7-month one-way trip. A Russian court sentenced a former U.S. Marine to 9 years today in a trial the U.S. ambassador criticized as, quote, theater of the absurd. Trevor Reed was charged and convicted of endangering the lives of 2 police officers. He said he could not remember the incident that took place in Moscow last summer because he was drunk. Today, the former Marine said this after the verdict.
Congress, my president, anyone in the United States, the State Department, Secretary of State, anyone who believes that they have an ability to help me, I'm asking for help now. I was hoping that this wasn't a political case. This was maybe just bad police. Maybe they wanted money. Maybe it was someone wanted some new stars, but it's clear to me now that this is a political case.
Reed is the second Marine convicted in a Russian court in just the last month. Both convictions have spurred speculation that the Russians are interested in some type of prisoner swap, although both sides deny such talks are taking place. Before the pandemic, there were very few countries where Americans could not visit. Well, now, as cases continue to soar, there are very few countries that we can. Today, the European Union reaffirmed its ban on U.S. citizens, but the rule is non-binding. And one EU nation, Croatia, a tourist hotspot, is still allowing Americans in if you can get there. Our Maggie Ruley did and filed this report.
With over 3,000 miles of stunning Mediterranean coastline, its rich history and medieval city walls that inspired Game of Thrones filmmakers and attract its fans.
Nearly 90,000 people alone come right here every single year to sit on a real Iron Throne.
Croatia's popularity is exploding, with more and more Americans making the trip, including more than 600,000 just last year. And now the country's offering an oasis for lockdown-weary Americans, becoming the only country in the European Union to welcome tourists from the United States without a quarantine. Erin Harrison jumped at the chance to travel abroad this summer and says Croatia has always been on her bucket list. But getting here wasn't easy. It took weeks of planning, including a stressful wait for COVID test results that she had to get just 48 hours before her arrival in Croatia.
I was at NYU because it has the quick turnaround time. I also even got the antibody test, so I'm double prepared no matter what.
A transfer in Paris, where she was unsure if her American passport would be an issue.
My plane is right behind. Next stop, Dubrovnik.
Then finally, after more than 20 hours of travel, she landed in Dubrovnik. We were there to greet her as she got off the plane. How was your flight? After showing her negative COVID test to Border Patrol and providing proof of a hotel where she was staying, Erin got the all clear.
I can't believe after all that I went through to get here, I'm here, I passed, and now I can go explore. It's a beautiful country, beautiful people.
The process she went through is a far cry from years past, when Americans were able to seamlessly jet set before the pandemic. The U.S. passport was one of the world's strongest, providing visa-free access to 185 countries. But because America failed to get a grip on COVID-19, movement has been strictly limited. And now people with U.S. passports are only permitted entry into about 30 countries.
That golden passport, now all of a sudden it's like X, you know.
To make sense of these ever-changing restrictions, Erin turned to an online community of travelers led by KREŠIMIR MACAN. What is the most common question from Americans? What are they struggling with?
What kind of documentation do I have to get ready? Because now they have information that they can come. So everybody is asking, what should I prepare? Because actually the homework is most important.
Croatia is the newest member of the EU, but it's the first to break ranks and allow American tourists to visit. Officials here tell us that it's worth the risk to open up their borders because American tourists bring money, and this is their last chance to save the summer season. The mayor of Dubrovnik, one of Croatia's most popular destinations, says that Americans are the #2 source of income for his city, right behind the UK.
Tourism is very, very important. It's 80% of our economy. It's based on tourism. I want to send a message to all Americans that Dubrovnik is waiting for them. It's nice and beautiful, and the streets are now wide open.
But he says it's a balance, and health and safety are the priority. After all, Croatia has a long history with pandemics. The first quarantine in the entire world was started right here in the city of Dubrovnik in the 1300s. Later, they built this building just to keep passengers who were traveling in from infected countries separate from the rest of the city. Today, they're leaning into that history, even using an old measurement, the cubit, the length of a famous medieval knight's arm, to social distance. This is the best model of social distancing I've ever had, with chocolate.
Chocolate, yes.
And local companies are selling hygiene. Hotels promote their new COVID-secure cleaning tech and guarantee hygienic rooms. If travel wasn't a luxury before, the pandemic world has made it one. Stacey and Darren Shaw traveled 26 hours from Arizona on 3 separate flights. But the long journey and the risk, they say, was worth it.
I needed a break. I think a lot of people, after this amount of time, just need something different. We felt, if we take the right precautions, if we do everything right, if we do everything by the book, this is not something that's going away tomorrow. Everybody's distancing. In the restaurants, there's no conversation about masks. Everybody has them. The restaurants, everybody wears them. We felt more safe coming here.
Most small businesses in Dubrovnik tell us they'll take all the safety precautions needed if it means they can open back up. But fewer people and less money has left many having to cope with what little business they can get, and some places have already had to shut down.
You have to pay your loans, you have to pay rent, you have to pay electricity, salaries. You're worrying if you will be able to keep your employees. So basically, yes, we were worried. Thank God we have you, the Americans, are back.
The mayor says his goal for this delayed tourist season is to make 30% of what they made last summer.
This is why Dubrovnik looks so beautiful, because with the tourism industry, we kept Dubrovnik like it was in the past.
he acknowledges it's a delicate balance. While Croatia's numbers have remained relatively low since the outbreak began, concerns over their open borders have led some countries, like the Netherlands, to add them to their orange list, recommending anyone who has visited Croatia to quarantine when they get back home. But the mayor says he doesn't think things will be back to normal for at least another 2 years, and says the country can't wait while people lose their livelihoods. For now, those Americans who take the risk and make their way to Croatia can have a once-in-a-lifetime experience of walking through one of the world's most famous cities without its famous crowds. Maggie Bruley, ABC News, Dubrovnik, Croatia.
Looks lovely. Our thanks to Maggie. And when we come back, good trouble then and now. And finally tonight, as Congressman John Lewis is laid to rest, the last living speaker from the 1963 March on Washington is now passing the baton to the next generation. So today we spoke with one of those young activists who's set to speak at the next March on Washington at the end of August, and promising to keep up Lewis's call to make good trouble. Here's ABC's David Wright.
Today, as the nation celebrated John Lewis's life and work, Lewis had the last word himself.
It is so fitting on the day of his service, he leaves us our marching orders. Keep moving.
A posthumous message published in today's New York Times, addressing young people.
Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe.
Like 23-year-old Ariana Evans.
Now it is your turn to let freedom ring.
Lewis was her age when he spoke at the March on Washington, the youngest speaker back in 1963.
Until true freedom come, until the revolution of 1776 is complete.
He knew that the fight for civil rights is a birthright and a burden passed down from one generation to the next.
He made so much history. To be as young as he was and still to be like such a pivotal point in civil rights just really proves to me that it's not even me that might change this country. It's really the generation below us. There's going to be a whole new, fresh set of ideas, and I think that we can really genuinely reimagine what it's like to be an American.
Lewis also knew the need for good trouble, as he put it, didn't stop in the 1960s, but will be carried on by Americans like Ariana, an Air Force veteran who has raised her voice since George Floyd's killing.
Yesterday was my first time protesting. But we've been tired. I've been tired. I've cried over this for years. We've been fighting the same battle.
Speaking out against a polarizing president.
Every time you get on Twitter, every time you say anything, sir, you're saying it out of violence, out of hate. And we're tired of being hated.
For young people marching for Black Lives Matter today and manning the barricades in Portland and other cities, John Lewis's message still resonates.
He gave his last dying breath to civil rights and to the Black people.
Today, President Obama invoked the villains of the civil rights era in Alabama, saying the work of Bull Connor and George Wallace has also been passed down to a new generation.
George Wallace may be gone, but we can witness our federal government sending agents to use tear gas and batons against peaceful demonstrators.
Do you think that's a fair comparison?
Absolutely. Using an over-militarized police force to beat your citizens into submission is not okay. It's never been okay. It was not okay in Selma.
Back then, Wallace may have been governor of Alabama, but on Bloody Sunday, African Americans had an ally in the White House. Ariana Evans, for one, is not sure that's still true.
Yes, we can draw the parallel between them two, but we also need to realize that his position of power effectuates in all 50 states.
You're saying that Donald Trump is George Wallace on steroids?
Absolutely. I'm saying that he is willing to destroy our democracy in a way that George Wallace probably wasn't.
And she believes there is as much at stake now as there was in the 1960s. So are you worried about this election?
Absolutely. And I think we need to fight tooth and nail until it's over.
And that, in a way, is John Lewis's work, isn't it?
Absolutely. I feel that even in his own way, he was telling us, like, fight for this.
The torch carried so bravely by John Lewis and his generation, now passed to a new generation. For ABC News Live, I'm David Wright.
Our thanks to David. And before we go tonight, our image of the day. The first game of the NBA restart in Florida. Players with the New Orleans Pelicans and Utah Jazz kneeling together, arms locked around the Black Lives Matter logo on the court during the national anthem. Competitors presenting a united front. And that is our show for this hour. Be sure to stay tuned to ABC News Live for more context and analysis of the day's top stories. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. But before we go, one final tribute to an American hero.
We shall splinter the segregated South into 1,000 pieces and put them together in the image of God and democracy. We must say, wake up, America, wake up, for we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient.
Your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful non-violent tool we have to create a more perfect union. We must march to the polls like never, ever before. It is your time. You must find a way to get in the way. You must find a way to get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
What you need to know right now. More than half the states now pausing or reversing reopenings in the coronavirus crisis. On the surging virus front lines in California,